In this episode, I'm going to talk to you about mold and mycotoxins in autism. Now, this is an area of research that is emerging in the last few years. There's some studies that are definitely finding links between mycotoxin exposure and autism. So I thought I'd give you a little bit of a primer on what mold and mycotoxins are, how they can potentially be harmful to us, and certain signs and symptoms that you can look out for that may indicate, further investigation is needed, and some basics around what a mold protocol would look like in case that is something that is affecting your child. So first things first, mold are fungi. So they're the fungi. It's not a family, but it's like a class of organisms that includes mold, yeast. So Candida is a yeast, but it's also of this fungi class, and also just mushrooms that we eat. They're also fungi. So mold is a part of this overall class of organisms. So mold are extremely prevalent in the environment, and mycotoxins are basically the toxins that are produced by the mold. So myco comes from, again, like mushroom. Think of it that way. And the mold secrete these toxins that we'll get into in a second, that can, obviously we can inhale them, they can be in the food, the water, and so on. And they basically enter our body where they do all sorts of damage. And here's the thing, mycotoxins are very often heat resistant, so they can survive the cooking and manufacturing process. So another thing to know is, for example, in the EU, about 20% of all grains tested that have been harvested have been found to be contaminated with mycotoxins. That's 1/5 of all grains in the EU. So to say that mycotoxins are prevalent is an understatement. They are actually the most prevalent toxin in our environment, even more so than chemical and heavy metal toxins. So some of the way mycotoxins can contribute to ill health include: they're toxic to our cells, they can cause mitochondrial dysfunction, they can damage the DNA, and this DNA damage has been shown to be carcinogenic, so cancer causing. Mycotoxins can suppress the immune system. This can increase our vulnerability to other pathogenic organisms. They can be toxic to the kidneys, the liver, other organs. They can contribute to oxidative stress. They can damage the gut barrier and increase intestinal permeability. They can deplete the antioxidant glutathione, which can lead to impaired detoxification capacity. And certain mold species can produce oxalate crystals. So these are crystals that they just can be formed in various parts of the body, including the organs, the bones, and so on, and they can cause a lot of pain and discomfort. So the two risks with mold are that not only can the fungi themselves infect and colonize us, they can get into our airways, they can get into our gut, but then they also secrete the mycotoxins, so they can produce mycotoxins inside us, and they can also produce just, if they're on your ceiling or in your house, they produce the mycotoxins, and then we're breathing them all day long. So the most common mycotoxins are produced by several families of mold. So Aspergillus is the most prevalent species, or the most prevalent species in their environment. So the most common way to get exposed to the mycotoxins Aspergillus produce is simply breathing in an indoor environment that has mold growing in it. Though their spores are tiny, so when we breathe them, they can get all the way down to our lower airways. This is why chronic mold exposure can be very difficult to deal with. So some of the mycotoxins that Aspergillus species produce are ochratoxin A and aflatoxins. Ochratoxin A is by far the most common mycotoxin in the environment. Now, as I also said, Aspergillus, they can actually produce these oxalate crystals. So if you ever run an organic acid test on your child, you may see oxalates are elevated. This is a very common problem for autistic children. So this is another reason why the organic acids test is very helpful to us to identify if oxalates are an issue for your child. Now, other kinds of molds, for example, Fusarium, can grow on grains such as corn, wheat, rice, and barley. They produce other mycotoxins like fumonisin, zearalenone. Now, this particular one resembles estrogen, the sex hormone, so it can give it estrogenic properties, as well as it's also harmful to the liver, the DNA, the immune system. But because it has estrogenic properties, it can kind of wreak havoc in boys' sexual development, basically, because it can estrogen, obviously, too much estrogen or anything that messes with the hormonal system can definitely lead to altered sexual maturation and things like that. So definitely not something you want your child being exposed to. And as I said, the Fusarium mold, they grow on various types of grain, including corn, wheat, rice, and barley. Penicillium is the blue-green mold that grows on fruits and vegetables and in indoor environments. They can also contaminate certain seeds and grains, and these also produce this ochratoxin A. So this is, again, the most common mycotoxin in our environment. And then there's Stachybotrys, which is that greenish black mold that you may have seen grow on things like drywall, paper, wood composites, fiberboard, ceiling tiles. These usually grow in higher humidity environments. So that's a little bit of a primer on mold and a couple of the mycotoxins they produce. Obviously, there's more mycotoxins. We won't really get into the names here. It's not important to know the names now, but what's important is to be aware of mycotoxins, that it's not a myth that certain people are more sensitive to mycotoxins. What little research we have on mold and mycotoxins in autism definitely shows that certain children are affected, and it's a fact of life that this is the most common. They are the most common toxin in our environment. Northern environments, more damp, dark environments. There's a lot of places around the world where mold is an issue. So, as I already alluded to it, there is mycotoxin testing out there. Now, I don't recommend that you just go out and do a mycotoxin test because, of course, it costs money and it's not the cheapest thing. And you want to have some clues whether or not mycotoxin testing is a good idea in your child's case. So, what are the several scenarios where mycotoxin testing would be wise? So, for example, number one is if your home has been water damaged in the past, or shows signs of mold accumulation. So, if you have visible mold in the house, or your house has been water damaged, or part of it has, now we are in the category of, okay, it might be a good idea. Now, if your home has poor ventilation and damp areas conducive to mold growth, that's another potential reason, or potential reason to consider it, at least. Now, if your child eats foods that are at risk for mold contamination, for example, corn, other grains, peanuts, these are very commonly contaminated with mold. If you do a stool pathogen screening, so a poop test, that comes back as negative for pathogens, but your child still has gastrointestinal issues or some other symptoms I'll talk about soon. So if the stool test looks fine, but your child definitely has gastrointestinal problems, then mold also may be implicated. And then finally, when certain markers on the organic acids test are elevated, it's a big clue that mycotoxins could be an issue for your child. And I'll get into that in a second. So in terms of physical clues, symptoms in your child that could signal mycotoxins could be an issue, these include fatigue, difficulty breathing, rashes, as I said, severe gastrointestinal distress, bleeding, for example, nosebleeds, eye pain, which can manifest as eye poking, muscle or joint pain, pain on urination, bladder irritability, serious neurological or psychiatric symptoms, or a sudden onset of serious neurological or psychiatric symptoms, muscle weakness, problems with coordination or balance, mental fog, confusion, headaches. Obviously, keep in mind that smaller children or nonverbal children, they may not be able to verbalize and express their pain or discomfort with some of these. For example, headaches or eye pain, things like that. So sudden increases in irritability, moodiness, aggression, self-injury, these can be a clue that there is some type of discomfort or pain there. So it's important to, if something like this happens suddenly, there's an increase in irritability, moodiness, aggression, whatever, it's important to consider factors that may be affecting this. As I've mentioned before, gut dysfunction is a common one that can cause these kind of things. But also, in some cases, not all the time, mycotoxin exposure or some other toxic exposure can be a factor. Now, in terms of testing for mycotoxins, as I said, I wouldn't recommend it at the outset. You would need to build a case for it with symptoms, your house or your environment being, let's say, damp or water damaged, or there's visible mold growing. Those are obviously big clues, especially if your child has certain symptoms like the ones I mentioned. And the other very good way to know whether or not mycotoxins could be a problem and warrant further investigation is when you run the Great Plains Labs organic acids test. There are several markers on the test that can signal potential mold toxicity. So 4 of them are associated with the Aspergillus mold, which again is the most common one in the environment. And then there's another one that's associated with mycotoxins produced by molds that predominantly grow on corn and a few other grains. So if those 5 markers, some of them are, at least one or more of them are elevated, it certainly is a clue that further investigation is needed. So just to mention, I have no affiliation with the Great Plains Laboratory. I've attended a couple of their workshops and summits to learn more about their testing, of course, to kind of get the insights from their best people there. And of course, I think their tests are amazing. The organic acids test, I recommend as the number one first test to run on your child. It's so incredibly useful, not only to check for yeast, candida overgrowth, bacteria, vitamin deficiencies, antioxidant deficiencies, energy production problems, mitochondrial dysfunction, potential mitochondrial dysfunction, oxalates, etc. But also those markers that I discuss in my book in chapter 3. There's a little section on mold and mycotoxins. Those markers on the organic acids test, they can also be a big clue, if elevated, that mold is a problem for your child. So this test is just for the price, the amount of markers you get more than 75 different markers. For the value you get to help you improve your child's health is unbelievable. It's absolutely unbelievable. So this is why this is another thing that the organic acids test can help us with, is to say it's basically an indicator that mold is a problem for your child. And only then, if those markers are elevated, or if one or more are elevated, then you can think about running an actual mycotoxin test. Now, there's a few out there on the market. The best value for money one is actually from the Great Plains Lab again. So their test screens for 11 mycotoxins that are produced by 40 species of mold, right? And so far I've not been able to find a test that comes anywhere near the value for money and the quality of the markers and the molds it tests for. So, and the mycotoxins it tests for. So if all of these align, so like I said, your child has the symptoms I mentioned, or at least some of them, of course. Some of those potential mycotoxin indicators on the organic acids test are elevated. That's another big clue. And then if your child eats grains or foods that are very often contaminated with mycotoxins, so corn, peanuts, other grains, and especially if your house has been water damaged or there's visible mold growing. So if enough of those are true in your case, then definitely it's worth running the mycotoxin test from the Great Plains lab. And what I've been told, listening to lectures by the director of the lab, Dr. Shaw, is that almost 100% of folks that mold those aspergillus markers on the organic acid test show as elevated, almost 100% of those that then further run the mycotoxin test will have that ochratoxin A. So there's a great chance that if the mycotoxin indicators on page 1 of the organic acid tests are elevated, that mycotoxins are going to be an issue. So we have some really good tools at our disposal to identify whatever health problems your child could be suffering from. So these are some really good resources. I would highly encourage you to get familiar with the tests offered by the Great Plains Lab, especially organic acids test, but in certain cases, there's even more advanced testing that can be run. So obviously not every child will need this, not every family will have to run this, but especially for more complicated cases, let's say, when there's serious symptoms, for example, serious neurological symptoms, for example, serious gastrointestinal problems, it's definitely something to keep it at the back of your mind, especially if you live in a region of the world where mold is a problem. Obviously, drier climates won't be as problematic, but more damper, darker, cooler environments, certainly it's something to think about. Now, if indeed you find that mold is a problem, mycotoxin exposure is a problem for your child, the typical mold protocol would include antifungal medications or herbal supplements, probiotics, binder supplements that actually absorb the mycotoxins in the gut. So things like charcoal, zeolite clay, and other supplements that can be used in the protocol include the antioxidant glutathione, chlorophyllin, and cholestyramine is a commonly used addition to a mold protocol. Now, the most important part, of course, is to remove the source of exposure. So this is extremely important, because you could do a mold protocol forever, but if your child keeps getting reinfected with the molds every day, breathing them in, or eating the foods that are contaminated with the mold, then that mold protocol will not do very much at all. So that's extremely important. It's a difficult point to discuss, especially if you do discover that mycotoxins are a problem. Obviously, in some cases, the best thing to do is to move house, and it's expensive, and it's difficult to think about these things, but sometimes that is the best and only option for your family's health. Hopefully, in your case, that's not the case. And again, this episode is a primer on mold toxicity, just to keep it in the back of your mind. Not every child will have this, a fairly small subset of children will be affected by this. I would think, although some research is showing otherwise recently, but let's kind of wait for more studies to come in before we can definitively say it. But it's important to keep this information at the back of your head. So if you run the organic acids test, if those 5 markers that I talk about, they're in my book in chapter 3, and obviously the Great Plains Lab, they have plenty of resources for you to read. If those markers are elevated, then you know what to do next. And that's the most important thing I want to teach you, is the tools in your arsenal to identify and address your child's hidden health challenges. Okay, so that's a little primer on mold and mycotoxins. I hope that you found this episode useful, and I hope to see you on the next one.